The bonding. When the ship's archaeologist is killed on a mission led by Worf, the Klingon feels responsible for the son she left behind. I'd like to point out that this is the first TNG episode written by Ronald D. Moore, who is most well known for the Battlestar Galactica reboot. Worf is on an away mission investigating some ruins made by the Koinonians, which is a great name, Koinonians. When explaining their history, Data says,
"The Koinonians were an intelligent culture which became embroiled in a war that lasted for several generations."
I like how every war on this show lasts for generations or hundreds of centuries, just to inflate this sense of futurism.
Worf and his away team are exploring some caverns when an undetected explosive device goes off, and Marla Astor is killed. Her son Jeremy had already lost his father, and now Troy and Picard are trying to figure out how to deal with his situation.
This is one of the only times I could think of in this show where we've seen some real-life implications of the stuff the crew runs into, but it's not affecting a main character. It's affecting a temporary side character.
Yeah, I didn't think about it like that. I was just glad that it was happening at all. No, not like that. I was glad that they were bringing it up, that they were addressing it. Picard points out,
"I've always believed that carrying children on a starship is a very questionable policy."
and I agree. What is the point of that policy?
Instead of discussing or trying to justify it, they just sidestep the actual question and talk about what they're going to do next.
Picard feels like he has a duty to go talk to Jeremy, who is played by Gabriel Damon,
who voiced Littlefoot in The Land Before Time and Little Nemo in the 1980s movie adaptation.
And he was one of the villains in RoboCop 2.
I like how everyone is torn up about this one particular person dying, but we've seen a bunch of people die, some right on the bridge, and everybody just kind of glosses over it. They even admit they didn't know Jeremy's mom that well.
How well did you know Lieutenant Astor?
Not very well.
I noticed there were a lot of close-ups in this episode.
The shift in filming style does kind of fit the shift in storytelling style, where it's actually focusing more on the characters in this episode and what they're thinking, as opposed to just the plot. Data brings up the subject of death to Riker, and it's a surprisingly well-written scene.
Data is asking how familiarity relates to emotional turbulence when somebody dies, but seems to forget about Tasha until Riker brings it up.
That's a good point. Overall, I still thought that was a surprisingly well-written scene. Troy talks to Worf, who is angry at not having a way to avenge Marla's death. Worf says he wants to make Roostai with Jeremy, where they will bond over the fact that they are both orphans. It's good to see Troy actually doing some decent counseling.
Agreed. When Jeremy is talking to Worf, he reveals how biased the Federation school curriculum is when the only thing he can tell Worf about Klingons is,
"You used to be our enemies."
Nice. For all the cultural heritage Worf seems to have, that's all they teach their kids. We used to kill you guys, right? Troy goes to talk to Picard, who has to quickly turn off his porn.
Come.
Damn it, Captain.
Counselor, how's the boy?
She's talking to Picard about Jeremy as well. During the conversation, Picard's reactions to Troy makes it look like he doesn't really care that much about what's going on.
Well, I've asked Beverly if we might get Wesley to talk to Jeremy about his father's death. The one unusual element is Worf.
Oh.
Okay, I see what you mean. Dr. Crusher tries to convince Wesley to talk to Jeremy, and I liked Wesley's realistic reaction. There was more depth to the scene than we usually get in this show.
The Enterprise detects a presence down on the planet, but there shouldn't be anything down there, so it adds to the mystery.
Troy then senses another presence on the ship, and I'm glad they actually listened to Troy for once and go to yellow alert.
Jeremy's in his room, reminiscing about his mom, and I really like the creepy vibe of his mom's doppelganger reveal.
Gonna find you. Must be in here somewhere.
Jeremy!
She tells Jeremy that they're going down to the planet. Her actions just serve to forward the plot. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. But I did like how Jeremy slowly warmed up to it instead of immediately jumping in.
I felt like that at first, but I feel like as the episode went on, his reactions weren't really consistent.
But he's emotionally distraught.
They should have done a better job of letting us as the audience know what he's thinking and feeling.
It's like I spell everything out to you.
When he's the central character that things are revolving around, I feel like we should have a better idea of how he's actually internalizing everything.
Yeah, so you want him to look at the camera and be like, I feel sad now. The writing is pretty weak. turns out the doppelganger is not physically on the ship, it's a transmission, and the crew figures that out and cuts that frequency, which then causes her to actually come to the ship.
When Troy tries to explain to Jeremy what's really going on, she's very calm and unworried. Through pretty much the rest of this entire episode, none of the crew seem troubled by the fact that some kind of weird alien presence is on the ship.
It manages to move around and do whatever it wants without alerting anybody.
Troy takes Jeremy back to his room, and it now looks like his house on Earth.
So eventually, Picard finally has to do what he's been trying to avoid and has to get involved with this kid.
I wish they had brought up the fact that Picard doesn't like kids more, because if I had just watched this episode, I wouldn't have known that.
Picard's monologuing makes more sense than usual in this episode, which was pretty refreshing.
I somewhat disagree. When Troy talks to the alien, she makes practical arguments about why Jeremy shouldn't go down to the planet.
And will you provide for his education, his health, his growth, a career, a wife?
But then when Picard talks to it, he decides to push his philosophical beliefs onto an alien and onto a child at the same time.
Jeremy must come to terms with his grief. He must not cover it or hide away from it.
Troy calls Wesley in and decides it's time for him to have a therapy session and relates to Jeremy's situation, which is what the alien wanted to make sure in the first place, was that he was going to be emotionally cared for. After all these conversations about loss and people's emotions and stuff, the alien with the stereotypically simplistic perspective decides to leave Jeremy on the ship and disappears.
And in the end, Worf makes his connection with Jeremy. The bonding. Overall,
An episode with surprisingly decent character development, surrounded by a very typical, uninteresting reality warping alien story. The alien's motivation is more interesting than usual, but it feels very underdeveloped compared to the character stuff. I'm glad to see Troy actually doing her job and actually being respected for it, but it almost felt like they wanted a character episode and then felt like they had to stick in an alien somewhere. But it's still easily the best episode in season 3 so far. I would give it a B-.
I gave it a B+. I had a feeling you wouldn't like this one because of your aversion to feeling things. I like that they address some real-world implications of the stuff that goes on, even though it's taken a long time to do it. The writing carries the emotional weight well, and it's way more in-depth than I would have expected. Even though Jeremy is not a main character, the exploration of how death affects him is passed to the main characters by association. We get a little insight into them. I felt like it was a good character episode, and the alien was kind of just the catalyst to get it started, but did seem a little unnecessary. I also enjoyed the pacing in this one, instead of drawing out tedious plot points over and over again just to make the episode last 45 minutes.